I'm not the one you need to worry about. I live here. Step aside so I can park my car.
You're gonna need more than words. I don't take kindly to strangers around here.
Imagine coming home after a long day at work, only to find your driveway turned into a tense confrontation zone. A moment that was supposed to bring peace and relaxation now turned into a nightmare. This was exactly what happened to FBI Special Agent Tessa Harris. What was meant to be a quiet evening quickly escalated into a dramatic and life-threatening situation that left the entire neighborhood stunned. It had been a grueling day at the office for Tessa. She had been finalizing a high-priority case with her team, preparing for a briefing early the next morning. As she drove out of the city, her mind kept running through her mental checklist. A morning run, picking up groceries, a debrief with her superior. There was nothing on her radar that signaled trouble. But life, as it often does, has a way of catching us off guard. Tessa drove her black SUV toward the gated community of Oak Ridge Estates, nestled on the outskirts of the city. She had moved here a few months ago, hoping to settle into a quieter life away from the hustle and bustle of her high-pressure career. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where families could walk their dogs without fear, where children could play without worry. As she tapped the remote for the gate, it creaked open with a soft whine. Tessa's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the rows of well-manicured lawns and homes that all looked the same. A sense of relief washed over her as she turned into her driveway, the thought of a warm shower and a hot meal waiting for her fueling her steps. But as she pulled in, something didn't feel right. She could see a figure standing at the end of her driveway, just a few feet away from her front door. It was a man, tall and stocky, wearing a reflective vest that caught the glow of her headlights. The strange thing wasn't just that he was standing there, it was the gun holstered at his side. Tessa's heart rate spiked, a flash of concern zipping through her mind. This wasn't an ordinary neighborhood patrolman. She knew the protocols, the procedures. No one should be standing outside of her home with a weapon unless they were law enforcement. And this man definitely didn't look like a cop. She slowed her vehicle, stopping just short of the driveway. With her window halfway rolled down, she spoke in a calm, measured tone. "Evening," she said, trying to gauge the situation without showing any hint of alarm. "Can I help you?" The man turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. He was in his late 40s, wearing an ill-fitting vest that bulged slightly at the waist. His face was grizzled, salt and pepper hair cut short. There was something off about the way he stood, too stiff, too aggressive for a typical neighborhood watch member. "You live here?" he asked, his voice gruff and uninviting. Tessa kept her posture relaxed, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Yes, I do. I'm Agent Tessa Harris, Unit 314. She gestured lightly toward her ID badge clipped to the visor, just in case he missed it. The man didn't budge. Instead, he leaned in a little closer, tapping his fingers against the handle of the gun. "I've been keeping an eye on this block," he said, his tone filled with suspicion. "You're not one of the regulars around here. Haven't seen you at any of the HOA meetings." Tessa's jaw tightened. She had expected this to be a simple interaction, but it was quickly becoming something more. She was accustomed to handling difficult people, especially when they were armed. The difference now was that the threat wasn't coming from a criminal or a suspect. It was coming from a man who had taken it upon himself to patrol the neighborhood, armed and with no legal authority to do so. "I don't attend the HOA meetings," she replied evenly, trying to keep the situation from escalating. "But I do live here. I'm not a stranger." The man stepped even closer, his chest puffing out. "I don't think so," he muttered, barely audible but enough for Tessa to hear. "I'm the neighborhood safety coordinator. It's my job to make sure this place is secure. And you don't look like you belong." Tessa felt the tension mounting. She knew that this could quickly turn dangerous if the man didn't de-escalate. As she took a slow, steady breath, she could feel the weight of her training kicking in. Her FBI instincts were sharp, but there was a different kind of pressure now. It wasn't the usual high-stakes operation, but the stakes were still just as high. She was standing in her driveway, facing down an armed man who was convinced she was the threat. "You need to step aside so I can park my car," she said, her tone polite but firm. The man didn't move. Instead, he reached for his holster, unclipping the weapon and pulling it halfway out. The metallic sound echoed in the quiet night, and in that moment, Tessa knew the situation had crossed a dangerous line. Tessa's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. This man wasn't law enforcement, and from the way he held the gun, he was no expert. He was flustered, jittery, and his posture, his stance, betrayed a man who had never been trained to handle high-stress situations. "You're going to need more than words," the man said, his voice thick with bravado. Tessa didn't flinch. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing her nervous. Instead, she shifted her posture slightly, her gaze never leaving his hand that now hovered too close to the weapon. "I'm not the one you need to worry about," she said. "But you need to lower that gun. You're pointing it at a resident of this neighborhood, and you have no right to do that." The standoff had begun. The tension in the air was palpable, each breath heavier than the last. Tessa could feel her pulse in her ears as she carefully watched the man before her. The gun was still pointed in her direction, but his hands were shaking. The weight of the situation was finally sinking in, but pride kept him rooted to the spot. His face, flushed with a mix of anger and fear, betrayed the bravado he was trying so hard to maintain. "I don't take kindly to strangers around here," the man growled, his voice cracking slightly. "You should have stayed in your car." Tessa didn't move, not a single muscle betraying her calm. She knew how to handle situations like this. She had done it before, with criminals much more dangerous than a disgruntled neighbor playing security. But something about this man, this self-appointed protector of the neighborhood, felt different. There was a desperation in his eyes, the kind of fear that makes people do irrational things. And the last thing she wanted was for this to escalate into something more tragic than it already was. She took another measured breath, keeping her tone even, steady. "Douglas," she said, using his name now. "You're holding a weapon in a place where you have no authority. I'm asking you to lower it." Douglas's grip on the gun tightened, his knuckles white against the handle. "I'm in charge here. This is my street. I'm the one who keeps this place safe. You don't belong here, not like the rest of us. You're just some stranger showing up, and I won't let anyone jeopardize my community." Tessa felt her muscles tense, but she stayed still, her hands visibly resting on the steering wheel, giving him no reason to think she was reaching for a weapon. He wasn't trained, she could see that now. He was a man playing at power, trying to assert control over something he didn't understand. "You're not keeping anyone safe by pointing that gun at me," she said, her voice cutting through the night air, calm but firm. "You're threatening someone who lives here. That's not security. That's intimidation." The sound of her words seemed to echo down the quiet street. She could see shadows flickering behind the windows of nearby houses, curtains twitching, the soft hum of phone cameras beginning to rise. Neighbors, no doubt, were recording the standoff, waiting for someone to make a move. Douglas didn't back down. Instead, he stepped closer, bringing the barrel of the gun just inches from her window. "You think you can intimidate me with your badge?" he sneered. "I don't care who you are. This is my neighborhood, and I'll protect it how I see fit." Tessa's heart pounded in her chest, but her breathing remained steady, controlled. "Douglas, you're holding a weapon you have no legal right to carry. You're making a dangerous mistake. If you shoot, you'll ruin your life. You'll destroy everything you've worked for." She knew the stakes, and she knew he did too. There was a crowd now, neighbors watching, recording, whispering in the background. She had to be careful. One wrong move, 1 second of panic, and this entire neighborhood could turn into a war zone. "You don't know what it's like around here," he spat. "You come here with your badge, your fancy job, and you think you're above everyone else. You think you can just waltz in and do whatever you want. But people like you don't belong in places like this." The words hit harder than she expected. It wasn't just a threat against her, it was a direct assault on her identity. He was looking at her not as a person, but as an outsider, a stranger who didn't fit the mold he had created in his mind. It wasn't about race or class or anything else. It was about control. His control over the neighborhood, his imagined authority that he felt he had the right to impose on anyone who didn't match his idea of what belonged. Tessa's eyes never left his hands. His grip on the gun was still shaky, his fingers twitching nervously. She could see it now, the underlying uncertainty. He wasn't as confident as he wanted her to believe. He was scared just as much as he was angry. And in that fear, he was dangerous. But fear could be managed. She knew that. And she could manage it now, if only he would listen. "You think you're protecting this neighborhood, but all you're doing is putting it in danger," she said, her voice unwavering. "That gun isn't going to keep anyone safe. It's going to make this worse." For a moment, it seemed like Douglas might listen. His body language shifted slightly, the tension in his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. But pride is a strong force, and Douglas wasn't ready to let it go. His voice dropped, barely a whisper but full of venom. "You don't know anything. I'm the only one who cares enough to keep this place safe. You just think you can come here and tell me what to do." Tessa's mind raced as she scanned his posture. He was unstable, but there was a way to end this. If she could just get him to see reason, to understand that he had no real power here, that this standoff could only end badly for him. She leaned forward just slightly, making sure to keep her movements slow and deliberate. "Douglas, you're not a soldier. You're not a law enforcement officer. You're a man with a gun, playing a game you don't understand. You can end this. Put the gun away and we can talk. But if you don't, I promise you, this won't end well for you. Not for you, not for your neighbors." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with tension. The faint sound of crickets chirping was the only noise that cut through the quiet. Tessa could hear the rustling of clothes behind the windows, the creak of a door opening just slightly to let in the night air, and the collective breath of the neighborhood, all waiting to see what would happen next. Douglas's face twitched as his gaze flicked between her and the neighbors, the cameras, the eyes watching. It was too late to back down now. He had to make a choice, but the longer he held that gun, the tighter his grip on his own destiny became. For a moment, Tessa thought he might pull the trigger. Douglas's finger was still poised near the trigger, his body tense, trembling with a mix of anger, fear, and pride. Tessa's heartbeat pulsed in her throat as she assessed every move he made. His eyes flickered from her face to the gun in his hands, back to the gathered neighbors, whose anxious whispers had turned to silence. She knew he was teetering on the edge, but there was still a glimmer of doubt in his posture. He was unsure of himself, of the consequences, of the choice he was about to make. In that moment, Tessa realized she wasn't just trying to survive. She wasn't just trying to protect herself from this man's weapon. She was trying to save him too. Save him from the destruction of his own pride, from the irreversible mistake he was about to make. He didn't know it yet, but the gun in his hand wasn't the real weapon. His pride, his misplaced sense of power, that was what could destroy him. But she could still stop it. "Douglas," Tessa said again, her voice calm but now with a firm edge that cut through the thick silence. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to destroy your life over this. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you think I'm doing here, it's not worth it. You're not a threat to me. But if you pull that trigger, you will be to everyone." For the first time, he faltered, his jaw tightening as though her words had reached something deeper, something buried beneath the layers of fear and ego. His eyes darted to the neighbors, to the cameras that were still pointed at him, some already rolling, others just waiting for a signal. He saw them, he felt them watching, and it only made his grip on the gun tighten. "You think you can talk me down?" Douglas sneered, his voice strained. "You think I'm just gonna back off because you show me a badge? You don't know me. You don't know what I've done for this community." Tessa could see it, the desperation behind the bluster, the exhaustion in his eyes, the cracks in his walls that were starting to show. He was tired. Tired of pretending, tired of holding up an image of control that he didn't have. This wasn't about protecting anyone. This was about fear. His fear of being powerless, of being seen as weak. And that fear had manifested into a weapon. She shook her head slowly, maintaining eye contact. "I don't need to know you, Douglas. I know what I see. And I know that man right there, holding that gun, is not the person who keeps this neighborhood safe. People like you, people who rely on fear to hold power, don't protect anything. You just destroy it." Her words hit harder than she intended. She saw it in his eyes, a flicker of realization, a crack in the foundation he had built. She wasn't just talking to him as a law enforcement officer now. She was speaking to him as a person, someone who had been on both sides of this type of situation, someone who knew the cost of letting fear rule. "I'm not asking you to back down because I have a badge," Tessa continued, her voice steady, but with a vulnerability that she hadn't shown before. "I'm asking you to do it because you're better than this. You're better than what you're about to do. You've got a choice, Douglas. You can put the gun down and walk away from this and we can move on. Or you can pull that trigger, and it's not just me that suffers. It's you too. You'll lose everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. The sound of the crickets had stopped, replaced by the distant hum of a car's engine in the far-off street. Douglas's face twisted as his mind battled between what he knew he had to do and the pride that was holding him hostage. But then something shifted. Tessa saw it in his eyes. The decision wasn't immediate, he wasn't going to give in easily. But the walls were crumbling, piece by piece. For the first time, he wasn't holding the power. She was. He let out a harsh exhale, lowering the gun just a fraction, his hands shaking more violently now, not from anger, but from fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of admitting he had been wrong. "I'm just trying to keep people safe," he muttered, his voice faltering. Tessa didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She just let him talk, let him process the reality of the situation. She could see the fight leaving him, the certainty that he had been right draining from his face. The crowd of neighbors had grown quieter, now watching with rapt attention as the drama unfolded. Tessa could feel their eyes on her, on him, on the situation that had become a spectacle. But she couldn't afford to think about them. All she needed to focus on was the man in front of her and the choice he was about to make. Finally, Douglas dropped his gaze, his hands still trembling as he slowly, reluctantly reholstered the gun. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Tessa didn't move at first. She stayed seated, her hands still resting on the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest, but her body still and controlled. She had known he wasn't going to shoot. She had known he was too scared to go through with it. But the moment had still carried a danger. One wrong word, one misstep, and everything could have gone horribly wrong. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice a little softer now, but no less commanding. "That's it, Douglas. It's over. You made the right choice." Douglas's eyes flickered up to meet hers, and for the first time, there was no animosity in them. Just exhaustion. And something else, something like relief. "I'm not a bad guy," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I just wanted to protect people." Tessa's expression softened. She understood. She knew the feeling all too well. The weight of responsibility, the drive to protect, the desire to make a difference, it could all twist into something dangerous if left unchecked. "You don't protect anyone by threatening them," Tessa replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Real protection comes from trust, from responsibility, from knowing when to step back." Douglas didn't say anything more. He just stood there, his shoulders sagging as though the weight he had been carrying for so long had finally begun to lift. The neighborhood was still, the tension dissipating like smoke in the air. But Tessa knew this wasn't over. The night wasn't done yet. There were still questions to answer, people to speak to, and a community that would have to reckon with what they had witnessed. She exhaled slowly, feeling the rush of adrenaline finally start to fade. It wasn't over yet, but for now she had done what she needed to do. She had saved herself, and maybe even saved him. As Tessa sat in her car, the tension of the moment finally began to settle, but the quiet that followed felt heavy. The sound of the gun being reholstered had been like a release, a sharp exhale after the suffocating pressure of an impossible situation. But the weight of what had just happened still pressed down on her chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Douglas stood at the edge of her driveway, his shoulders slumped, the gun now tucked away. He wasn't the man in control anymore. The quiet murmurs from the neighbors, the soft click of phone cameras still recording, filled the air with an unsettling buzz. They had witnessed everything. They had seen Douglas, the self-proclaimed protector of their street, collapse under the weight of his own delusion. And now, they would have to reckon with what that meant. Tessa's mind raced, but she kept her composure. She had handled dozens of high-stakes confrontations in the field, but this one felt different. It was personal. This wasn't a criminal she was facing, it was a neighbor. A man who had thought he was doing good. A man who had believed that control and fear would make him a hero. But all he had done was put everyone in danger. The standoff had ended, but the aftermath was just beginning. Tessa finally reached for her phone, her fingers cold against the screen. She quickly sent a message to her supervisor, just a simple note: situation under control. Gun threat neutralized. No shots fired. Neighbors recording. She wasn't sure what would come next, whether the authorities would be called, or if the HOA would try to sweep this under the rug. Either way, she knew there would be questions. And she would be ready to answer them. She glanced back at the neighborhood, where the tension was starting to bubble to the surface. Some neighbors were retreating inside, shaking their heads, as if pretending nothing had happened would make it disappear. Others lingered, their eyes still fixed on her, as if waiting for a sign of what to do next. The silence was broken by a voice from across the street. A woman, older, in a bathrobe, standing on her porch with a cell phone in her hand. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tessa nodded slowly, giving a tight smile. "I'm fine. Thank you for asking." But the woman's gaze didn't leave her. There was something in her eyes, something that spoke of fear, of judgment, of a community trying to make sense of what had just happened. She wasn't the only one feeling it. Tessa could hear the whispers. Did she really live here? What was that all about? As the moments ticked by, the tension in the street began to feel unbearable. The air was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. Douglas was still standing there, now shifting from foot to foot, his eyes darting around as though he didn't know what to do with himself. His pride had been shattered in front of everyone, and he wasn't sure how to pick up the pieces. Tessa didn't wait for him to make the next move. She opened the door of her car and stepped out, her boots tapping softly on the concrete. The sound of her feet hitting the ground felt like an anchor in the storm. She walked towards him, her gaze steady, but her mind focused on the bigger picture. She wasn't just going to let this moment slip away. There would be consequences, there had to be, but how the neighborhood handled this could either heal the divide or widen it. "Douglas," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "This isn't just about you and me. This is about the entire neighborhood now. What happens next, it's on all of us." Douglas looked at her, his face twisted in frustration, the remnants of anger still visible behind his eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go like this," he muttered, his voice soft, almost defeated. "You didn't mean for it to go this way," Tessa repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But it did. And now you have to deal with the fallout." The reality was sinking in, but he wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. He had spent years building up a reputation as the neighborhood's enforcer, the man who kept them all safe with his unyielding vigilance. Now that facade was crumbling, and Tessa could see it, the cracks in his confidence, the realization that his self-imposed authority meant nothing anymore. He was no longer the protector. He was the problem. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tessa crossed her arms, standing her ground. "That's the thing, Douglas. You thought. And when you start thinking that your way is the only way, when you stop listening to the people around you, that's when things go wrong. When you point a gun at someone like that, it's not about protecting anyone anymore. It's about control. And control without accountability is dangerous." Douglas winced, as though her words had hit a nerve. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure of what to say. The arrogance that had once fueled him was gone, replaced with the awkward shuffle of a man who was suddenly very aware of how wrong he had been. "You can make this right," Tessa said softly, "but you need to own up to what you've done. And that starts with stepping back. Let the community decide what's best for them, not you. You don't need to be their hero. You just need to be their neighbor." He stood silently for a moment, his gaze flickering between her and the neighbors who were still watching, some with concern, others with judgment. And for the first time in a long time, Douglas seemed to understand. He wasn't the protector. He was the one who needed protecting. From himself. "All right," he said finally, his voice hoarse. I'll step down. I'll let the HOA handle it." Tessa nodded. She knew it wasn't going to be easy for him. His pride had taken a hit, and that wasn't something he could just let go of overnight. But he had made the first step. And that was enough, for now. "I'll make sure the HOA knows what happened here," she said, her tone softer now. "But you need to be honest. About everything." Douglas nodded, his shoulders slumping further. There was no more fight left in him. He was broken, but there was still a chance for him to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But it was a start. Tessa turned to face the neighborhood, her gaze sweeping across the street. The silence was still there, but it was different now. People were starting to move, stepping away from their windows, lowering their phones. The neighborhood wasn't quite the same anymore, and neither was she. "Is everything all right?" came a voice from behind her. She turned to see a man in his late 50s, his face lined with worry but also something else, curiosity. Tessa gave him a tight smile. "It's handled," she said. "For now." But she knew this wasn't over. The real work, the difficult conversations, the repairing of broken trust, it was all waiting. And it would take time. But Tessa had been through much worse in her career. If she could get through tonight, she could get through anything. The streets of Oak Ridge Estates were still, but the atmosphere had shifted. The hum of the neighborhood, once so familiar and comforting, now felt off, distorted by the aftermath of what had just happened. Tessa could feel it in the way the neighbors avoided eye contact, in the way the usual greetings were replaced by tense silences. They had all witnessed a dangerous standoff, and though Douglas had lowered his weapon, the damage had already been done. The question now wasn't about whether the confrontation had ended peacefully. It was about what the neighborhood would do next. What they would say when the dust settled. How they would deal with the unsettling truth that one of their own had been so close to becoming the very thing he claimed to protect them from. As Tessa walked toward her front door, she could feel the weight of the eyes on her. The neighbors, once polite but distant, now seemed to hover just outside her line of sight. Some walked by quickly, their heads lowered, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others stood on their porches, whispering to each other, exchanging glances as though trying to piece together the story that had just unfolded. Tessa unlocked her door, but as she stepped inside, she was met with an unexpected silence. The house, once a refuge from the chaos of the world, now felt heavy. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the night. The gun, Douglas's shaking hands, the crowd of neighbors watching, the fragile peace that had been restored. But she wasn't sure if the peace was real. Inside, she hung her jacket on the coat rack and walked into the living room, where the dim light of a table lamp cast long shadows on the walls. Her phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was a message from Marcus, one of her colleagues. "How are you holding up? You good?" Tessa stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She wasn't sure what to say. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she explain the weight of what she had witnessed, and the weight of what had almost gone terribly wrong? "I'm fine," she typed, trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. She hit send and set the phone down, her eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the neighborhood was still. The cars that had gathered earlier in the night had long since left, but the streets were far from empty. The quiet hum of uncertainty hung in the air. The fallout from the confrontation was far from over. She could feel it in her bones. The real question now wasn't about Douglas. It wasn't about the gun. It was about the neighbors. About how they would process what they had just witnessed. Would they rally behind Douglas? Would they see him as a misguided protector, or as the dangerous man he had proven himself to be? And what about her? What would they say about the woman who had stood her ground, unflinching in the face of danger, but who now had to carry the burden of what had happened? Tessa had been in dangerous situations before. She had faced gunfire, death threats, moments when she had wondered if she would make it out alive. But this was different. This wasn't a mission in the field. This was home. This was supposed to be a place of safety, a place where she could let her guard down, even if just for a moment. But now, the very idea of safety felt like an illusion. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The sound was too soft, too hesitant to be anyone but a neighbor. She opened the door to find Mrs. Langley, the woman who lived 2 doors down, standing on the porch. Mrs. Langley's eyes were red, and there was a nervous energy in her stance. Tessa could see that she was trying to gather her words, as if unsure how to approach the conversation. "Agent Harris," Mrs. Langley said softly, her voice trembling. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Tessa nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Thank you." The older woman stepped forward, her hands wringing together. I've lived here for years," she began, her voice hesitant. "I've never seen anything like this. And I know I should have said something sooner, but I didn't. Doug had been acting strange for a while, you know? But I didn't want to make a fuss. I didn't want to cause trouble. But after tonight, I'm scared." Tessa's heart tightened as she listened to Mrs. Langley's words. It wasn't just about Douglas anymore. It was about the fear that had been festering in the neighborhood for so long, a fear that had only been validated by the confrontation. People had been scared of what they didn't understand, scared of the man who had made himself the judge, jury, and executioner of the neighborhood's safety. "I understand," Tessa said gently, stepping aside to let the woman into the house. "It's hard to know what to do in situations like this. But what matters now is that you're talking about it. You're not alone in this." Mrs. Langley hesitated, then took a step forward. I can't help but feel guilty," she whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. "I didn't do anything. None of us did. We all just let him keep going, thinking he was doing what was best. And now I feel like I failed." Tessa's heart softened. "You didn't fail, Mrs. Langley. None of us saw this coming. But we can't change what happened. All we can do is make sure it doesn't happen again. And that starts with owning up to it. With facing the truth." The older woman nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes. I didn't know where to start." "Start by talking," Tessa said firmly. "Start by telling the truth. The neighborhood needs to hear it. They need to know that we don't need someone like Douglas to protect us. We need each other." Mrs. Langley gave a shaky smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Agent Harris. I'm glad you're here." Tessa watched her leave, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy in the air. She had saved herself tonight. But saving the neighborhood, saving the people she lived among, was a much bigger challenge. One that she wasn't sure she was ready for. But as the door clicked shut behind her, she made a vow to herself. She would stand her ground. She would make sure this neighborhood wasn't ruled by fear, by pride, or by a man who had let his ego blind him to what real protection meant. And she would start tomorrow. The morning after the standoff, Oak Ridge Estates seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for a storm to pass. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light over the neighborhood, but it didn't feel like a new day. It felt like a continuation, one that would lead to some uncomfortable truths and, for some, a reckoning they hadn't expected. Tessa knew today wouldn't be easy. The phone calls had already started coming in. Her supervisor had checked in, asking if she needed any support, but she had assured him that the situation had been handled. She had no choice but to leave it at that for now, let the dust settle and allow the neighborhood to process what had happened. But Tessa also knew that the real work began today. The HOA was already scheduled to hold an emergency meeting to discuss what had transpired, and she knew the neighborhood would be divided. It wasn't just about the gun or about Douglas anymore. It was about what kind of community Oak Ridge Estates wanted to be. As Tessa dressed, pulling on a simple but professional outfit, she felt the weight of the night still lingering in her shoulders. The tension hadn't fully dissipated. How could it? A man had threatened her with a gun, and the entire neighborhood had witnessed it. They had seen it with their own eyes, and now they would have to decide how to interpret what they had seen. She stepped out of her front door and into the crisp morning air, the cool breeze washing over her. The world outside felt ordinary, birds chirping, a dog barking in the distance, but she knew that wasn't the reality anymore. The morning felt like a facade. The neighborhood was fractured now, and nothing would be the same. As she walked toward the HOA clubhouse, Tessa noticed the whispers had already begun. Neighbors lingered on their porches, exchanging glances, their conversations hushed. She could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Some looked at her with empathy, others with fear, and a few with judgment. She didn't know what they thought of her, but she wasn't concerned about that right now. She was concerned about what would happen once the meeting began. The clubhouse, usually a place for casual meetings, was buzzing with an energy Tessa hadn't expected. The air inside was thick with tension. The usual group of about 20 HOA members had swelled to nearly 70, with people standing at the back of the room, leaning against the walls. The long wooden table at the front was littered with papers, some of which had been hastily thrown down in the chaos. The chairs were filled, but no one was sitting comfortably. The room fell silent as Tessa walked in, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, drawing every eye in the room. It wasn't the first time she had walked into a room of tense faces, but this time it felt different. This wasn't a debrief with colleagues, this was her neighborhood, and she could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. Some were curious, others accusatory. Some were scared, but all of them were questioning everything. The chairwoman of the HOA, Margaret Dwyer, was already at the front, her hands shaking slightly as she held a gavel, unsure of how to proceed. Her voice was shaky, but she did her best to maintain control. Let's get started. We're here to discuss the events of last night and what actions, if any, need to be taken. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, but no one spoke. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first. Tessa took a deep breath, knowing she needed to address this head-on. She stepped forward, her posture straight and resolute. "I'm Agent Tessa Harris, and I'm here to talk about what happened last night. But more than that, I'm here to discuss what happens now." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the unspoken judgment, and the quiet fear. "I understand the confusion. I understand the fear. And I understand that many of you are probably wondering what comes next. But I need to make something very clear. What happened last night wasn't about who lives here or who doesn't. It wasn't about who's a real member of this community. It was about one man, a neighbor, taking it upon himself to enforce rules that didn't exist. And when he decided to point a gun at me, that wasn't about protecting anyone. That was about something much darker, about control, about fear." She let the words sink in, watching the faces around the room. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful, but all of them seemed to be listening. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "We have to ask ourselves some tough questions now," Tessa continued, her voice steady. "How did we let this happen? How did we allow one person, one individual, to act as if he had the authority to decide who belonged and who didn't? We can't ignore that. And we can't keep pretending that everything is fine." There was a soft stir among the crowd, whispers flickering through the room like sparks. One man, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a wrinkled face, stood up, his hands trembling as he spoke. "But he was just trying to protect us, right? I mean, he's been around for years. He's been the one to keep watch, to make sure things don't get out of hand. We didn't ask for this, but shouldn't we thank him?" Tessa's stomach tightened. She had been expecting this, but it still stung to hear it. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could anyone defend Douglas after what had happened? "Protect us," Tessa said, her voice growing sharper. What Douglas did last night wasn't about protection. It was about fear. His fear. And it's that fear that turned him into a danger. He pointed a gun at me, at someone who lives here. That's not protection. That's intimidation. The room fell into another uneasy silence. She could see the wheels turning in some of their minds, but others still clung to the idea that Douglas had been their hero. Margaret cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the meeting. "Agent Harris is correct. This isn't about one person's version of safety. We need to discuss what's best for the neighborhood. What should we do about this? Should we remove Douglas from the HOA safety chair? Should we consider disarming our patrols?" A woman in the back stood up, raising her hand to speak. "We can't just throw him out. He's been doing this for years. He's made us feel safer. He's been there when no one else was." Tessa looked at the woman, shaking her head. Safety doesn't come from intimidation. It doesn't come from fear. Safety comes from accountability, from responsibility. It's not about who has the biggest gun, it's about who can handle themselves without it. Douglas lost control last night. And now we all have to live with that. A long pause followed her words, but slowly, people started nodding. The weight of her statement seemed to hit them, sinking in like a stone dropping into still water. It wasn't just about Douglas anymore. It was about them, about all of them. The community needed to decide if they were going to live in fear or live in truth. Margaret's voice broke the silence again. All right, let's take a vote on whether or not to remove Douglas from the safety committee. The room buzzed with nervous energy as people whispered amongst themselves. For the first time, Tessa saw a glimmer of hope. This wasn't over. The neighborhood had started to face the truth, and that, she knew, was the first step in rebuilding. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take time, and it was going to take everyone in the room, everyone in the neighborhood, owning their part in what had happened. But this was the beginning of something new. A change. And Tessa was ready to lead it. The room was quiet, too quiet. The weight of the vote was hanging over them all like a storm cloud. Tessa had made her case, and the neighbors, some with reluctance, others with obvious agreement, were now making their decision. She could feel the tension in the air, a pressure that came not from the vote itself but from what it symbolized. This wasn't just about removing Douglas from his position as the HOA's safety chair. It wasn't even just about the gun he had pulled on her. It was about something deeper, something that affected every one of them. It was about fear. It was about control. And it was about whether or not this community would let those things dictate their lives. Tessa stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed, her posture still as composed as ever. But inside, her thoughts were racing. The neighborhood had been divided, and no vote could erase the scars of what had happened. There was no undoing the standoff, no taking back the fear that had gripped this community. But what came next? That was the real question. What would they choose to do now? Margaret stood up, her gavel in hand, her fingers still trembling slightly as she looked out over the room. All right, she said, her voice wavering. We've had enough discussion. Let's take a vote on whether or not to remove Mr. Brenton from his position on the safety committee. One by one, the hands went up. Some were hesitant, others quick to raise their hands, but they all went up. And when Margaret called for the count, the result was clear. The majority had voted to remove Douglas from the committee. Tessa couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. It wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was a step. The community had made its choice, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the neighborhood was beginning to reckon with its own complicity in the chaos. Douglas, for his part, didn't say a word. His face was pale, his eyes distant, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. Tessa knew that this was the hardest part for him, accepting that his place in this community had come to an end, not by the force of a gun, but by the collective decision of the people he had tried to control. As the meeting drew to a close, the room began to empty out, the weight of the decision still lingering in the air. Tessa stepped outside, feeling the cool air hit her face as she made her way to her car. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. The same street where just a few nights ago, she had been forced to face down a man with a gun. The same street that had now witnessed a pivotal moment in its history. But Tessa knew that the real work was just beginning. As she got into her car, her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Marcus. "How's the neighborhood holding up?" it read. She typed back quickly. "It's starting to heal. We've got a long way to go, but they're finally seeing the truth. We all have to face it now." Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment as she thought about the past few days, the standoff, the tension, the aftermath. It wasn't just about Douglas anymore. It was about the choices people made. It was about standing up to fear and judgment, about choosing truth over pride, about holding each other accountable. As Tessa started the engine and drove off, her mind wandered to the future. Would Oak Ridge Estates ever truly be the same? Would it ever be the safe, peaceful place she had hoped for when she moved in? She didn't know. But she knew that this was just one small chapter in a much larger story. The real question wasn't about the neighborhood. It wasn't about Douglas. It was about all of them, how they would choose to live with the truth, how they would choose to face their own biases, their own fear, and their own need for control. In the end, that was what mattered. That was the real test. As the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the horizon, Tessa felt a quiet sense of resolve settle within her. She hadn't just survived the night. She had forced the truth into the open. She had made a stand, not just for herself, but for the kind of world she wanted to live in, a world where people didn't let fear decide their fate, where community meant more than judgment, where the strength to do what was right came not from a weapon, but from the power of voice, conviction, and courage. And as the road stretched out before her, Tessa knew that the journey wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If you've been watching this story unfold, I hope it's made you think about the choices we all make, the assumptions we hold, and the power we each have to change the world around us. This isn't just a story about one neighborhood, it's a story about all of us, about how we deal with fear, pride, and responsibility. If you found this video compelling, make sure to like it, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, and comment below with your thoughts. How can we move forward as a community? What do you think we can learn from Tessa's experience? Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can change the narrative. Let's make sure we never stop questioning, never stop listening, and always choose to make the right call when it matters most. Stay safe and stay aware.